Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Boyven, Vice President at PortSys. I want to welcome you all to our webinar, Cloud First, Cloud Best, Who Owns Your Security? First, I want to share with you some housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will also be available on demand for attendees to share with your colleagues after it concludes. Attendees will be muted, but if you have questions, please put them in the questions section of your control panel, and our experts will answer them later in the webinar after their presentation. Please note that there are additional materials available for download in the handouts and in the deeper dive section of our website, including videos and ebooks focused on zero trust initiatives. I've included a link to the deeper dive section in the chat for your convenience. Now on to the webinar. Our mission at PortSys is to provide advanced security technologies that enable your organization to simplify the current cybersecurity chaos, strengthen their organizational security posture, and unify access to resources wherever they reside. This is more important today than ever before, especially with the big push across all vertical industries to adopt a cloud-first, cloud-best strategy. This webinar will address the security challenges that organizations face in a cloud-first, cloud-best environment and how they can better manage those challenges while significantly reducing their attack surface and making their end users' lives easier. Looking at the agenda, we will be covering the drivers behind the migration to cloud first, cloud best, the planning required to make that move and the pitfalls, the potential and often unanticipated impacts a cloud first, cloud best approach has on an enterprise organization security profile, what it takes to secure the constantly evolving hybrid infrastructure most organizations have today, some real-world examples of how to approach your security challenges in a cloud-first, cloud-best world, and at the end, answers to any questions you may have during the presentation. Again, please post those in the questions section of the presentation. Today's webinar will be hosted by Chris Wilder. Chris is the Research Director and Senior Analyst at TAG Cyber, which supports enterprise teams with its Research as a Service offering, also known as RAAS. Joining Chris to provide his insights will be Michael Oldham, CEO and founder of PortSys. With that, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Michael. Thank you all for attending, and thank you all for having me come on, Mike and Tim. This is good stuff, and it's an incredibly important topic that we as security practitioners and IT folks need to deal with. So TAG Cyber, as Tim mentioned, TAG Cyber does, we work with about 150 different enterprises, CISOs and their security teams to effectively look at the market, look at the landscape, look at their security portfolios, understand what vendors and what technologies are out there, then how to better build build their security programs more more effectively, all the way from compliance all the way down to choosing what vendor to choose for firewalls or ZTNA type solutions. And so this area of interest is vis-a-vis especially cloud and data security. Of the 800 different inquiries that we field every year from enterprises and some vendors, number one and number two on the concern list, the thing that keeps CISOs awake at night is cloud and data security. That's number one and number two. Very quickly now, API and SaaS applications are becoming 3 and 4 respectively. So what we're seeing is there's a lot of movement, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of need and desire for moving into the cloud, and why organizations are really trying to look at this as a way to, there's a lot of good motherhood and apple pie type things on this slide here, but just the reasons why people are looking at the cloud as a better way to do business, and not just the typical financial concerns to things like CapEx versus OpEx. That's a very important thing, but there's a lot more reasons why. But because what we're seeing is such a growth in the cloud industry and the cloud business, most of the common attack vectors are pretty simple, and they're ones that most enterprises don't have. But what we're seeing right now is that about 90% of organizations have at least one application, critical application in the cloud. It's going to be CRM, it could be ERP. Most likely it's email. We're seeing a big, massive shift from hosted email systems to Office 365 and beyond. And largely that's just because of the patching and the vulnerabilities and keeping those systems up to date. And so about 90% of the companies we deal with or that we see in the industry have at least one critical app in the cloud. 75% of them have at least three, and it's growing. And sadly, they have at least three, but there's dozens and dozens more that they don't even know about. So, things like shadow IT and a lot of a lot of folks, especially, for example, marketing people, for some reason are the worst. They tend to, if they need something, they'll just spin up a Hadoop incident on AWS, or they'll go off and get Dropbox or Google, especially if you're a Microsoft house. So it's a big problem, but these are the things that's happening, and it's a reality that's not. Some vendors or some enterprises, some vendors are adopting this and willfully going forward with adopting the cloud, but the ones that aren't are having it done to them. So it's a really interesting thing, and because of this growth, we're seeing a massive increase, week over week increase in the amount of attacks coming up. It's somewhere in between 10 to 15% increase week over week, and the big areas that we're seeing these attacks coming from are specifically Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and they're largely being driven by nation-state attackers, not just hacktivists or some of these other folks. And I think part of this is because we're seeing a softening of the economy, that folks are actually losing their jobs and they're going off and taking their talents somewhere else. And these nation-state groups, and we make a joke at TAG, is that hacker organizations never have layoffs. And so it's very important that you understand where these attacks are coming from, but they are literally being sponsored by the nation states. So part of this, the reason why I'm talking about this is part of this strategy is being driven by the May 21st executive order that President Biden sent down, very focused on how do we improve as a nation our cybersecurity posture. And so when we talk about this, one of the big key pillars of our cybersecurity posture is zero trust. And that is the primary pillar of this new cybersecurity strategy that the government is pushing. Now, because it's an executive order, yeah, it only affects the government, but one of the pesky little agencies in the government is the SEC. And typically the SEC will push those regulations down from a compliance perspective into publicly traded companies. And as the publicly traded companies adopt zero trust, so do the vendors that support those companies. So if you think about this executive order, you can say, well, this doesn't affect me, but it does, and it will. And so this is, like I said, Michael, this is such a huge, compelling topic for people to get into. And so I can't thank you enough for having me, because I could talk days and days and days about this.
No, we're glad to have you. I think it's fantastic, your perspective. You come at it from the perspective of seeing many different organizations and the kinds of people and challenges that they see from governments down. And I think you're absolutely right. Things are changing quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's good. I think cybersecurity hygiene is something that we can all benefit from. Some more on the hygiene side than others, but no, I think though that it's something that it's evolving, and I think the industry is being forced into it, and it's a lot of the bad guys that are trying to to cause havoc and cause challenges. And then I'll jump into kind of why these organizations are moving to the cloud, but I'll tell a quick story. I do quite a bit of work with government, mostly with the State Department and the Department of Defense. And one of the pieces of my work with the State Department is helping countries to assuage China from coming in, using Huawei and different networking technologies, and upgrading their cloud infrastructure and upgrading their 5G and those types of things. So we launched on a big endeavor project through MENA, which is 5 different countries in northern Africa and Jordan. And we did a series of reverse diplomatic missions, discussing with cloud providers there, telecom providers, working with them to try to figure out how to best be competitive against against the world, and making sure that people have access to commerce and they have access to education and the internet and all the great things that come with cloud. And if you don't think these nation states aren't paying attention, 2 days after we got done with this thing, every single one of the attendees in our reverse delegation, every single one of them had a massive attack against them from China. So this is a really big deal, and this is why we as a country, and this is why we as practitioners need to be much more ready and know that these people are paying attention to what we do. And so we just have to prepare and be ready to move forward. And it goes back to hygiene and things like that. But so let's talk a little bit about why folks are going to the cloud, and kind of get into the meat of this thing. Let me just jump back to that one. Yeah. So obviously these are the big things of why organizations are moving to the cloud. I'm not going to read them to you, but the only big thing I would put onto this one, obviously cost savings is a huge challenge for a lot of organizations. We're actually not seeing a reduction in budgets at the enterprise level. They seem to be remaining very flat, but there's no budget for point solutions. So platform solutions are the things that are coming in. So from a cost perspective, it's really important to think about, as you start going and planning this, what are the costs that I have to incur down the road when I start implementing more and more technologies, especially around zero trust. And management and adaptability is easy. One of the things too that it does improve, cloud services do improve your security posture. A lot of the cloud providers have different ways that they address security. Oracle's got a very unique way that they separate the control plane from the data plane, while Microsoft has their Active Directory and their solutions with Defender. You don't have to buy the hardware, and it's continuous monitoring and delivery. But one of the things I would add to this list here is increased compliance. And compliance is one of the big issues a lot of CISOs are having struggles with right now, because what's happening, especially with ZTNA and zero trust, that the whole mantra is it's ripe for the NIST guys and GDPR and a lot of the other security compliance framework organizations are really starting to batten down the hatches around zero trust, and understanding that you need to have a strong multi-factor authentication starting point. You need to have, you need to continuously authenticate, because what happened with COVID, the world became very distributed, and so now we have whole different compliance challenges. And so zero trust is becoming a massive component that are requiring companies to look at new delivery models, and cloud is a very attractive one for that. So let's go to that next slide there, Michael. So the pitfalls. So in terms of pitfalls, the one I could say is the biggest one that most companies don't do is they don't build a strategy. They don't build a solid plan on what they're going to get out of their cloud. They don't understand that the world that it's not just you put it in the cloud and forget about it. It affects all the different pieces of it. And so you really need to understand as a CISO or as an organization or IT person, you really need to understand what you've got within your organization. And we talk a lot about about inventory. If you don't know what you have in your organization, then you can't make good decisions on terms of what you put into the cloud and what you don't put into the cloud. And what we found is most companies find a massive amount of overlap and a lot of things that they probably should have never made investments in. But it's important to understand what's actually within the organization, whether it's critical applications, or if it's dark shadow IT applications. So you really need to invest in technology that allows you to have visibility into what you've got into the organization, so that at least you can put the security controls in place, and you can be able to decide whether you're going to support those applications or you're not. And the kind of hand in hand with that is developing the migration plan. You don't just want to shove it up there, right up at once, But work with a cloud provider. A lot of these cloud providers have dedicated teams to helping companies map it out and plan it out and do the right thing as they move towards the cloud. One of the other components of this, I would also say, is making sure that you're compliant and making sure that what you're doing actually goes as is compliant with whether if you're a publicly traded company or if you're a company that has PII. You have to know what kind of compliant, critical, sensitive information you're putting into the cloud, because it does go off your premise, and sometimes there's some ramifications around that vis-a-vis data sovereignty and GDPR that you need to kind of take to make sure that that's covered. And then the other side of that is, you really need to understand what you want to do with it, and do you put applications into the cloud and do they break the rest of the organization? So that goes back to good planning, proper planning. And then really the other side of that is, a lot of people think that if they put applications into the cloud, that they don't have to deal with security. That's not true. You still have to deal with security. You have to deal with fallouts of a breach. You have to deal with all the components that go into that, but you still own that security. And the security is not just data, but it's sensitive data. And so those are the things that you really need to kind of understand for the challenges that you'll find. Pitfalls are challenges. There's no such thing as a problem. Problems are not overcomable, but challenges are. So, Michael?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think you make a lot of great points, and I think proper planning is really what it comes down to. The fact that we end up looking at the cloud, a lot of people look at it as this is the panacea, this is the thing that's going to solve all my problems. But it actually creates more challenges, at least in the initial stages, than it does solve, because you end up doing things like spreading your infrastructure with more attack surface. So there are a lot of things that we think about. So when we start looking at from a security perspective, we think that it's going to be easier, but it really is more challenging, because what you've done is you've actually increased your footprint in the different attack surfaces. So if you've got SaaS applications out in the cloud, if you've got other resources in cloud data centers, and then you have everything that's happening in your local data center still, because most people haven't, all of a sudden one day they flip the switch and 100% in the cloud. You have to look at the mix of the resources that you have, and in the beginning, especially, it's going to actually increase your footprint. But nobody actually went out and said, hey, we're moving to the cloud, we need to give you more resources. Usually they say, we're going to move to the cloud, so we're going to have less resources, or at least try to do it all the same. And the cloud's different. It's not the same thing that you've been doing in your data center. Billing is a great example of that. If you move to a cloud data center, AWS or Azure or any of the other different platforms that exist out there, the way that they bill is completely different. When we were looking at our own data centers, you bought hardware, you had maintenance contracts and things like that. It was very defined. When you move to the cloud, it's billed on bits and bytes, everything that you're doing, the communications, et cetera. And so you end up with a very different solution, and security is no different than that. It's a different process. And you're trying to work with a cloud provider, whether it's SaaS or whether it's an infrastructure play that you're looking at, that has its own rules and regulations, and they're all different. So when you start moving to the cloud, there's a lot of challenges that you have to deal with, and you have to think about this and plan ahead of time, because those things are going to be the pitfalls that you're going to run across. And I was actually sitting, kind of a funny story, I was on a ski lift about a week and a half ago, just before RSA, and I happened to be sitting, and there were two other people on the chairlift with me, and the two of them knew each other, and I was just on the ride, and they said they were talking about how much cloud is actually costing their organizations right now. It's a huge expense. One of the guys was feeling a little bit better after you heard that the other company was spending $20 million a month on their cloud infrastructure bills. And he said, we can't even figure out where we're spending all that money. He said, even on the weekends when nobody's working, we're spending $450,000, and we don't even know, how we're billing it. So they were going to start turning things off so they could figure out exactly what was costing them. And the other guy was like, well, we're not spending that much. We're only spending $50,000 a month. But it was a big hit for them as well. So part of that's the planning that goes into it. A lot of people think that they can take their existing applications, move them up to the cloud data center, and everything's going to work like it was, and they're going to start saving money. Well, it doesn't really work that way. A lot of times you have to rewrite your application so they take advantage of the elasticity of the cloud, so that you're not using resources when you're not needing them. But that requires some changes to what you're doing. So there are a lot of different challenges, and security becomes a big problem. When you start looking at the different attack surfaces that you have, and you start looking at multi-cloud environments, and I think the last statistic I saw is the average organization now has 2.26 clouds that they're using within their organization from an infrastructure perspective. So they're not just using one cloud, now you're gonna have multiple clouds. Again, you're expanding your attack surface, the potential attack surface that you have, and you need to be able to manage that. And a lot of people are using technologies like RDP and things like that to manage the actual implementations. So you've still got to be able to protect those. What's also really challenging is you can make it very complex for the end users. So when you start moving resources to different places, where the end users are going to get access to all of those things. So those are things that I think are really important to take a look at.
One thing, Michael, I just want to add to that. Over the last, I guess probably over the last 3 months, we've had conversations with the CISOs from several very large companies, specifically in healthcare, which generate a tremendous amount of data, telecoms, and then some of the folks and a couple folks in government. But the big thing about this is they've made massive investments in Splunk, on the SIM product Splunk, and so they put that internally, and they were managing that, and that seemed to manage well. And the problem with Splunk is as you grow and the more events that you have to track and the more data that you create, the more expensive Splunk becomes. And so the challenge that they had is they started using Splunk in a cloud environment, and that turned up the telemetry so much that it became cost prohibitive for them to be able to continue using Splunk, because they were spending $3 to $5 million just on logging. Had nothing to do with the actual use of the mediation and the detection, the mediation, the response, but it was the actual data that was coming out of that. So to your point, Michael, in terms of being hybrid, you have to understand what you've got before you go in and understand the unintended consequences of what the cloud does and what it's not going to do. And so that's that. And the decision was not, Splunk's a bad product. The decision was, it's purely financial, and Microsoft is giving us, Microsoft Sentinel is giving us the logging for free, and then I'm off to the races. So,
yeah, I think that's a really good point, because there are lots of things that we didn't know when we started moving to the cloud, and that's the surprise that people are finding, and that's what's ending up costing money to lots of organizations, is these surprise things that you never would have really thought about, but then suddenly becomes obvious when you get a big bill that you weren't expecting. And this is a big challenge. I was just looking at a recent statistic that was talking about multi-factor authentication. MFA is one of the simplest ways that you can help to protect your organization from access. But looking at the cloud and looking at what people are doing out there, most of the organizations don't have most of their resources protected with multi-factor authentication. And I can understand the problems there. You've got SaaS applications and other kinds of resources that are out there, and they all have their own different requirements. Now, there are new technologies that are coming out that all the time, cloud-based technologies that try to make that easier. But a lot of those technologies require a very significant change in your infrastructure. You have to change your identity infrastructure, you have to change your networking infrastructure, you have to change your applications. There are a number of different things that have to happen to put some of these new technologies in place, and that's a real struggle as well. So it's not surprising to me that many organizations really haven't stepped up to be able to protect themselves, even with something as straightforward as multi-factor authentication across the board. In fact, most organizations are still struggling with their local security, just being able to manage security for their existing environment, never mind going up to the cloud. And I think a lot of people falsely looked at it and said, look, I'm going to move to the cloud, so I'll be all set. I'll get rid of my local stuff. I'll move everything to the cloud eventually, and then I'll be all set. But that's not true. It's not going to really work. In fact, with the number of resources that you have in your local environment and the number of, for example, SaaS applications, I was pretty surprised by this. 22% of organizations have more than 50 SaaS applications. Not too surprising when you think about the functionality that exists there, but that's a lot. And if you're trying to manage that, everyone's a different organization, a different company. with different services, different policies, different multi-factor authentication, et cetera. So you need to figure out how to be able to manage with that, along with your local security, because most hybrid organizations aren't going to just flip a switch and be in the cloud. They're going to take, as Chris was saying earlier, you're going to take a step and then another step and another step and do things along the way. And we've seen that with our customers as well.
Yeah. Like we always talk about zero trust being a journey, not a destination. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's not something that people are able to even, they can't do it all at once. It has to be done step by step. And that's one of the challenges. So when we look at managing the hybrid environment, there are some things that you really have to put together when you're thinking about this and planning around this. You need to be able to have control over access to all of these different resources, right? You need support for software as a service, for infrastructure or platforms as a service. All of your cloud-based applications and resources have to fit together. But it also has to, as you're looking at this, trying to figure out how to control, you have to control the access for your local resources as well. And not just the simple ones. There, a lot of new modern applications are web-based, but what about client-server applications or legacy applications, SSH and IoT, things like RDP for management? There's a number of different technologies that most people have in their existing infrastructure that you still need to have, and you still need to figure out how to protect. So you have to bring all of these together. You have to be able to find a way to simplify the process so that the end users have an easy experience that's complete with multi-factor authentication. And you'd like to have context of access as well. So it's not just about the user's credentials, it's about the user, their credentials, and where they are at that moment in time. What kind of device they're on, what the security status of that device, bringing all of those things together. And I think one of the biggest things is you've got to figure out a way to be able to implement this in your current environment. Trying to go in and change and bring in a large new technology is extremely disruptive to an organization. And that's where we're at today. We see a lot of different applications and resources that are out there that are designed to try to help an organization from a security perspective to be able to manage some of these complexities. But the challenge is they're either incomplete or they require a very significant investment in understanding your existing infrastructure and then migrating that infrastructure, whether it's your identity or whatever else that you're looking at, network, with some kind of an SDP or something like that, where you're trying to figure out exactly how you reshape your entire environment. It's kind of like trying to change the tires on a tractor trailer rolling down the highway at 70 miles an hour. It's not so easy to do. And there are ways to be able to do that. And then, as Chris mentioned it before, compliance is really important, that whatever you're doing, you've got to figure out a way to be able to report on everything that's going on within your infrastructure so that you can manage compliance. That becomes really important across the board. Who got access to what across the entire organization? So these are some of the things that you need to think about when you're looking at this. So where do we go from here, right? So as we start looking at this, at PortSys, we believe that security can empower a business. It's not the old days where the cybersecurity team was the department of no. That was the way it was before. Business has now really changed and retaken the driver's seat. And so that's where you see things like shadow IT or other technologies that are being implemented by departments, irrespective of whether they're being secured or not. We've made a very complex environment that needs to be brought in, but it has to be done in a way that can actually propel the business forward. And I think we're at the point now that there are technologies that exist, and I'll talk about what we do in just a moment, but technologies exist to actually empower the business and allow for things like digital transformation without the burden of worrying about security. Security was always one of those things, well, we can't do this because those devices wouldn't be secure or that information could get stolen or be leaked out to the world. There are ways to be able to put these things together, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about coming up. So we're looking to meet this challenge, and we've got a solution called Total Access Control. The idea behind this is really designed to protect that hybrid enterprise, right? It's also designed, importantly, to deploy in your existing infrastructure without making changes. You don't have to change your identity infrastructure. You don't have to change your networking. You don't have to change your applications. You just put this in, along with everything else that you have in your existing infrastructure. And TAC is designed to work with that infrastructure and help you to be able to migrate across to a zero trust style architecture at the pace of change that your organization can manage. It's designed to be easy for the end users as well. You know, one of the biggest things that people make mistakes about, we've made a lot of mistakes in the past in particular, is that if we don't make it easier for the end users to do their jobs every day, they become one of the biggest obstacles to deployment. They become one of the biggest challenges that we have to deal with. And really, they want to come in and be able to do their jobs. That's what they want to do. So we want them to be able to do their jobs, but we also want that to be secure. So we try to focus on that to make this an easier choice for end users. And one of the other pieces that we look at from what we can help companies with is providing the flexibility to maintain choice. As people start going out there and adopting different kinds of cloud technologies or different solutions, one of the big challenges is what happens when it doesn't work. If you move out to a particular infrastructure and it's just not working for you, and you're going to need to move to another infrastructure, you need to figure out. If you haven't planned ahead of time for this, it's very important that you can change, right? So something bad happens, or something, billing becomes too expensive, or a new alternative that's more in line with your business becomes available. You need to be able to have the flexibility of that choice. But if you're locked in, which a lot of different technologies, a lot of different the cloud providers, et cetera, create this this environment where users are logging into that environment, and you don't really have a choice because this is the way that they do it without dramatically disrupting your end user community. We provide the ability to give you that flexibility and have a consistent deployment for your end users that always works the same way. So these are just some of the top points. And I don't want to get into a whole bunch of functions and features, but what I do want to do is talk a little bit more about customers and some of the successes that we've had with our customers. So I'll start with one customer. This is kind of an interesting journey. This is a fairly typical journey for most organizations. This is a global pharmaceutical marketing company, and what they came to us with is they had a problem. They were trying to, they thought that they wanted to move to Microsoft 365. At the time it was Office 365. They wanted to move to Office 365, but there were security issues with doing that. They had because of the type of organization they are, and that they're working with pharmaceutical companies, they had very specific needs around making sure that endpoints were valid, that they were company owned, or they were authorized. And the ability that Microsoft had to be able to provide that wasn't enough for what they needed. So that was their initial point. They wanted to go in and do device validation and be able to connect to Office 365. And so we helped them with that to be able to make that happen. But what happened over time is that company went from one project, which was trying to get, move themselves across, which, by the way, saved them over $3 million in the first couple of years that they were implementing this. But over time, what they've done is they've actually moved all of their resources and applications that are providing access. Now they have over 1,400 applications that go through total access control for more than 15,000 people around the world in 5 data centers that exist. And what it did for that organization, it allowed them to be able to create a platform that they could work with to move to cloud resources, to local resources, to have everything in one place so that they could take on and accelerate the pace of their organization from a digital transformation perspective. So that's one example of one of our customers. Another quick example is a law enforcement organization. Law enforcement, in this particular case, their needs were very different. Their needs were around serving multiple partner agencies, police forces, for example. They had multiple different police forces. They all had their own policies, their own device policies, et cetera. And so you couldn't push out an agent to all of those remote devices and all the devices that, for example, police were using in their cars to look up license plates or do other things that they needed to do as part of their jobs. But each town controlled what was going on within their devices. They had their own device policies. So it was a big challenge on a policy perspective for how they were going to manage access to all of this sensitive information. Obviously, criminal records and things like that are very private and sensitive information. So what we were able to do is provide a solution that allowed them to be able to deploy to all of their constituents, provide access without any deployment of agents or anything else on those remote devices. And in fact, never having to worry about having information left on those devices should that device be lost or stolen. So they used a combination of technologies. Our clientless RDP and RDP app technologies were one of the pieces. But they too then took that and started to move forward and remove all of their VPN infrastructure, where they could actually, instead of having people signing into VPN for different kinds of organizations and partners, they could do that very simply and easily through total access control. So we were able to help them to be able to provide that solution for them that really helped them to be able to make the process of accessing that information much easier for their constituents across the board. So different industry, overseas, looking at the national healthcare system. One of the challenges that they have is, and I remember hearing about this, this wasn't this particular organization, but at one time they did a check and an audit inside their network to see how many unknown devices they had. They expected they might see 30 or 40 unknown devices in their infrastructure. This was a few years ago. And when they came back, they found 14,000 devices that were connected to their infrastructure that they had no idea about. And that obviously is a big alarming situation. And what people were doing is because it was hard to connect to resources with the corporate devices that they were providing, they were just signing on using their own devices. Well, obviously that's a big challenge. So when we start looking at the healthcare world, they want to be able to provide access. They want to be able to control that, but they also have to meet privacy issues. They have to figure out how to be able to do that in a way that doesn't compromise the organization. So they were able to take total access control in their current environment, and they deployed a pilot in a day. It was very simple for them to do, to put that pilot in their existing infrastructure, have it up and running in a day. That then led to the people who were involved in it said, well, this is a heck of a lot easier for us to do every day. We've got one place that it goes, does single sign-on to our applications and resources. Why can't we do more of this? And that led step by step to the organizations really picking that up and getting a lot more involved. The end users helped to actually drive this process. So it created a lot from a security perspective and gave them the capability to be able to audit everything that was going on and all the access that they were seeing. Very quickly, a financial services organization that actually provided financial services to other financial service organizations. They actually had, they have now over $1 trillion in money that's being managed through these organizations. So when you think about privacy and security, you think that that would be a pretty important thing, which it was. They needed to figure out how to control access, not just to their own staff, which they did obviously, but also to their clients and their clients' clients to be able to provide a very strong way to be able to do it. But in the financial world, there are lots of people who don't want to have any barriers. They want to be able to sign on as if there was no sign-in, there was no credentials or anything else. They wanted to make it very, very simple. So they were able to do that, put this in. We helped them make that very simple. And for third-party resources as well, because they did have offshore development labs that were also getting access at the same time. So all of these things came together, and we were able to provide them the types of access that they needed, being able to go in through all of the resources they need, get rid of VPNs that they had been using across the way, and protect RDP, which actually became an attack vector for those organizations, even though they were hosted up in AWS. They were, one of the alarm bells that went off is they found that there were people that were scanning their RDP ports that were out there, even though they're in AWS, and they were very concerned that people were going to start to attack those. So we provided the security over those interfaces that would keep that from being publicly available, so you wouldn't see RDP out to the outside world any longer, for example. So one of the things that we can do is to help to close those ports to the outside world, so any of the hackers out there can't see any of the resources that you're protecting on the inside. So there are a number of different things that happen along the way with that organization that really made a big difference for them. And finally, this is one that I really like because it was so surprising to me. This was a healthcare organization in the biotech space, and they were a very interesting company from the fact that they helped monitor brains in operating rooms. So they would actually have all kinds of different. That's what they do, is they have nodes and things to monitor what's going on in someone's brain when they're undergoing brain surgery. So that's one of their big challenges. But they started off as, typical customer. They had some remote applications, people working from remote places for billing apps and for expenses and other kinds of things that they brought in. But when COVID hit, it was actually a threat to their business, because now with COVID, you can't just take a doctor and put a doctor in to monitor the equipment that's going on within the infrastructure, and along with the fact that everybody had to be remote. So they ended up realizing that they could use total access control as a connection for doctors to be able to, the monitoring physician. So they'd have a technician that would be working, a monitoring physician that would be remote somewhere else, monitoring surgery while the surgery is going on live, and being able to tell the surgeon real time what was going on with the surgery and how it was impacting the brain and different functions within the brain. It's absolutely astounding to me that they took the technology that we had provided, and again, our technology is really a platform to allow organizations to find ways to be able to do what they need to do from a business perspective, and accelerate what they're doing for business. So now they have physicians that can be remote to the operating room while its surgery is going on, and being able to fully participate in that surgery and give them the information, the surgeons on site, the information that they need. So I found that to be just a complete surprise from a customer perspective of what we were looking at. So, I think the point in all of this was the impact that a good technology can have on somebody's business is crucial when we start thinking about the things that we want to do for our customers. And that's really the most important thing, is that we want to support our customers in their ability to move their businesses forward and do it securely. And so, that's really what we're all about. That's what we're trying to do.
I was kind of laughing when you were talking about the brain scanning side of it, because I think that's what TikTok does to our children. But no, it's interesting. This is really good. And I know this from, when I first started the relationship with the PortSys team. We were going through a bunch of talking to them about some different activities that they were working on. And one of the best things I liked about what you said, what you've told us, because as an analyst, we tend to get very caustic and jaded, oh, I've heard this story before. And a lot of vendors don't back up what they say with, well, if you want to talk to my customers, talk to my customers. And that's exactly what we did. And they afforded us the opportunity to be able to spend some time with, 5 or 6 of their customers that had deployed. And universally, and I said this kind of tongue in cheek earlier, but when we talk about access and zero trust and all of this, it's a journey, not a destination. And universally, your customers said, in terms of just helping us to get to this next step, it is incredibly valuable. And so that's kind of having a partner on the ground like that can help you get from A to B to C to D and E. And we're going to trip over ourselves all the time. We always do. But having somebody that can help you along that journey is so important. And just kudos to you guys. I mean, in terms of also one of the universal comments that we got back from everybody was, your support is incredible. I could pick up the phone, I could talk to Michael, I could talk to Tim, and if I need to have this change, I can make that change. It's very relationship oriented. And so I appreciate, the updates on the references, and so good stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that support is when you have a customer and you've gone through the process of acquiring that customer, you want to make sure that that customer stays on board. And the way you do that is by providing exceptional support, and we always try to do that. But that's something that you find out after the fact, down the line. You don't find that out up front, but it is something that we really pride ourselves in being able to do for our customers. And our product also develops in concert with our customers' needs, right? Those are the ways that we actually develop our technologies to be able to make sure that they're going to work for our customers. And you're the people that actually give us the inspiration to figure out the new functions and features that should work and in fact do work with our customers along the way. So just really in summary, we're going to open it up to questions. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put those questions into the chat. But security is your responsibility. It doesn't matter if it's in the cloud or if it's local. If something happens to your organization, if you have a breach, it's not the cloud's fault. It's yours. It's going to come back to you at some point in time. So when you're looking at trying to make a migration and move to the cloud infrastructure, you really need to plan that out. Our tools and technologies are designed to be able to help you with that. Our staff will help you with that. But it's really, ultimately it's your responsibility, however you choose to do that. And, just remember that you have to be resourced appropriately to be able to make that work, because it can be a challenge, especially when you're first moving to the cloud or as you're, starting to sprawl, which is a real challenge. Is you've got to be able to have a plan so you know how you're protecting yourselves along the way. So those are some of the things. Chris, any last words here before we go to some of the questions?
No, I just kind of going back to initial points, obviously cybersecurity hygiene is incredibly important. And the fulcrum of all, all cloud is access and understanding where access is coming from and be able to control that, whether it's through a SaaS application or in the cloud application. One of the things we didn't mention, I know this because it's really not in your wheelhouse, but for organizations adopting a cloud strategy is really, especially for organizations like healthcare and financial services, all the heavy regulated marketplaces, we really need to step back and also include and enact some level of data encryption, data classification, meaning classifying data. We in the government, at RSA, I did a presentation on this dopey 21-year-old kid who had access to the Joint Chiefs of Staff intelligence briefings and put them on discourse. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned there, specifically around data classification. And so it's really important, especially for healthcare and financial services organization, not just to classify data, but put strong retention policies and purge policies especially into the organization. Then also continue to reevaluate, audit, come back every so often and do your security assessments. Make that investment, because that way you'll know where you're at, and you can always have a plan to move forward. And it goes back to the journey. So that's all I've got on this one, Michael. This is
yeah. No, thanks, Chris. I completely agree. We focused on access control. That's as a company, we focused on being able to control access. And as you said, data is also important, and that's where we can marry very nicely with other technologies that actually focus on the data side. Access is crucially important. That's what we focus on, but it is a bigger project than just one thing. This is where I've talked to the DoD and other places. They know that there are many different aspects of security that they have to deal with. It's not just one thing. But we focus on access, and I think that's one of the kind of the cornerstones from a security perspective that you really have to focus on is, once you get control over access and you know who's getting access and you're very sure of who's getting access and under what context, it gives you a lot of power to be able to do more things. And I think that's why we've always focused on the access approach overall. So wanted to open it up to questions. Tim, have you been monitoring what's going on? And
yeah, I have a few questions, Michael and Chris. One of the questions was, how can you architect your enterprise to manage local and cloud without having to rip and replace all the existing investments you've already made into your infrastructure, and is this something tech can help with?
So that's a direct product question for me. So that's that's one that
I,
you know, total access could be.
I can say real quick, don't
Yeah.
give it, vendor, do not ever go into an organization and say, just rip this out and replace it with us. We're good. That is always the worst place to start. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, one of the biggest challenges that organizations have is they've already made a huge investment in all of their existing infrastructure. It doesn't matter whether it's cybersecurity or applications or whatever. There's a huge investment already made. And that's one of the things when we first developed TAC, when we started looking at this, we wanted to develop a technology that would work with what you already had in place. So, you know, if you've got technologies that you like and that you want to work with, great, keep those technologies. If there are technologies that you can replace, you can bring down your footprint from a security perspective. Those are the things that we wanted to be able to do to allow an organization to figure out how they can manage their migration to a more secure infrastructure. It's not up to us to say, here's the product that's going to magically fix everything, because a lot of that's really policy, procedure, how you're providing access to those. But TAC is designed to work in an existing infrastructure with the technologies you already have without disrupting those. And I think that's a really big difference to what we do versus everybody else. Lots of other technologies, there are technologies out there that say you can just migrate to us over time, but it might require very substantial changes to your infrastructure. Like you've got to add a whole new identity infrastructure, or you've got to connect it to your existing, your existing identity infrastructure. And then have that sync to a third-party organization where you have now taken all your crown jewels and stuck them into the cloud somewhere from a security perspective. And that may be fine with your organization if you look at it from a risk perspective. But some organizations may look at that and say, well, I don't want to give somebody else access to all of these things. And so, again, when we did the development of TAC, it was designed to be able to be put into an infrastructure in place and then allow you to be able to create, we call it publishing, but publishing those resources for local and cloud all through one common interface, and be able to do that without disrupting your existing infrastructure. In fact, we've had customers, like I mentioned, that once they put this up, their end users started saying, hey, can we do more? Can we do more here? Because it makes it easier, you know, single sign-on and portal-based access, regardless of where they come in from. So it really helps to be able to make the migration when your end users are actually happy about what's happening. It does make a difference. So that's what we designed Total Access Control to do, to be able to bring those things together.
And then another question, and I'm not sure if this is for Chris or Michael, but regarding performance when you're trying to implement this type of approach, what are some of the performance issues and how can they be handled?
Well, I can take a first crack at it. You know, I think that performance is a real significant challenge for lots of organizations when you start moving to the cloud, et cetera, especially if you're in a hybrid environment. You know, how do you control access to your resources that are both in the cloud and in the local data center? And how do you do that in a way that latency doesn't become a problem? You know, there's some things, use something like RDP as an example, that are very latency sensitive. You know, if you're looking at any kind of virtual desktop infrastructure, that can be very sensitive to latency. You may have old legacy applications or other things that are out there that you have to deal with, and they can be very particular about the kinds of connections. So when you're looking at certain technologies, you have to take that into account, because if you're looking at a cloud-based technology and most of your resources are local, then you may have some performance issues if there's latency or whatever. Now, they may be able to have technologies that speed that up. You might be able to use SD-WAN technologies that you would have to invest in to be able to deal with that. But there are many different choices that you have. But Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah, I mean, a couple things. One is obviously network architecting, and network architecture is incredibly important. And I think one of the things that a lot of companies, a lot of enterprises are doing now to avoid some of the latency challenges while increasing security, because I think that's what a lot of people, they think about security, well, that'll just put latency into my network, and because it has to go through a pipe. That's not necessarily true. I think there's a lot of architectural benefits by actually having consistent and very strong IAM policies, identity access management and least privilege access policies, that are consistent both from the on-premise environment into the cloud. But one of the things that we're really advising our clients to do right now, and especially as they go and deploy, is really kind of getting deep on the microsegmentations piece of this, because not just network isolation and isolating different applications and tools, but that will help immensely on the not just on the latency and the throughput, but it also increases security. And NCR, the big National Cash Register company that basically runs about 75% of the restaurants of the world, their Aloha system, they just recently had a massive PII breach, and pretty much every restaurant in the US at least was affected by that, because what was happening is the Aloha application was sitting on the same terminal, onto the same network, on the same, as everything else. And so microsegmentation helps with the latency on that. About 10 years ago, I did a pen test on a casino. It was my Ocean's 11 moment, and brought in my pen testers, and we sat down on a Sunday afternoon. We were supposed to start the exercise on a Monday. My guys got bored, and they were able to take over the entire hotel, or the entire casino, in about a half hour, just because of the fact that they realized that the televisions don't have segmented security. They don't have security on them, but that security was connected into the entire casino. So they took over the entire casino in about a half hour, and they were opening up drawers, shutting. They locked out the cash room. It was a mess, and we were done the next day, and they didn't want us around. But that's kind of that's kind of a misnomer on security, though. Latency and challenges like that's people think that you add security to it, it's latency, but no, if you do better security hygiene and security architecture, it'll go a long way. And I think you're spot on, Michael, with your points.
Yeah, we actually, when we developed total access control, as far as segmentation goes, we decided that what we're doing from an access control perspective is we only provide access to the resources themselves, not to the network, the base network underneath it, where somebody can then attack and pivot, and if they break out of the application or whatever else. Being able to provide that microsegmentation of the resources is absolutely critical when you're looking at that. And so, from a security perspective, it's a big issue. And that's what VPNs were not good at traditionally. That's one of the big challenges that you'd have with VPNs, is that if you were able to get out of your resource, or you're on the network. So, and stolen credentials became a huge issue, because somebody would come in, find a VPN, steal the credentials, sign in, now you're on the network, you can go wherever you want. And that segmentation becomes really important in the long run.
And last question before we wrap up for the day. There's a lot of different flavors. Chris, you had mentioned zero trust, but there's I forget how many zero trust providers out there now claiming zero trust capabilities. And so it gets a little confusing, especially when you get into some of the deployment options for some of these solutions. For instance, and this goes back to the rip and replace question. How do you work with what I have already for existing IDPs? Can you talk about some of the challenges there?
Well, zero trust is not a product. It's a philosophy. It's an architecture. It's like I said, it's a journey. And so, there are a lot of vendors out there that are talking about the fact that they are the zero trust platform. And a lot of times, and sometimes it's confused with security mesh. It's confused with even XDR at point. Sometimes it's the detect and response side, the threat intel side of the world. But zero trust is, number one, it's not a product. Zero trust is something that you adopt as a strategic initiative within the organization, and it's a direction that you go that is something that you have to be committed to. And there's a lot of things that go into that. And it's not just like rip and replace and start with new technology. That's why I talk a lot about inventory and discovery, is understanding what you have in the organization, so you don't have to make those decisions on whether I rip and replace these solutions, or can I use it to augment something else. And this kind of is it, but it's zero trust is you just have to really familiarize yourself with the never trust, always verify mantra. And if you kind of go into it with that eyes wide open, then that's the starting point there. And then understand what you've got, and then you've got to understand what your identity is. And identity hygiene is something that we don't talk enough about as practitioners, because a lot of times you'll go in and you'll see identity is the Wild West. And then kind of looking at what the micro segmentation side, all of these things that I'm talking about are all just function of hygiene. It's not going off and having to buy a new product, but you also have to be able to apply that to the mantra of never trust, always verify. And so I guess in a roundabout way, I hope I answered the question, but it really is. And then it kind of goes back to another point you made earlier, Michael, is about educate, train people. Security is everybody's responsibility. And you've got to be able to let them understand kind of what their responsibility in the organization is, and then give them the right to be able to give them the access, enough access to be able to do their jobs. And they'll keep coming back, I hope. So.
Well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. And thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time today. If you'd like to find out more, we're here. Would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out at any point in time.
Thanks, everybody, for attending the webinar. This will be available on demand if you have colleagues who would also like to listen to it at their convenience. So feel free to share the link when it's sent to you after the webinar. Thanks so much for attending, and stay safe and secure. Have a good day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.